Can I talk to Travis? Travis, could you please come to the microphone? And maybe respond.
You need to use the mic, sir.
Clear? Turn your hearing aid up. I'm in it close as I can get. Donald, I think I heard you say that we gave them money that may or may not have been spent on the project. Is there some confusion there?
Well, yeah, it is to me. I mean, I'm not making accusations like she's saying I am. But if you read the responses in here, it says Mr. Bond wrote a letter or says that he guarantees that it was spent on the project. But there's not any receipts and all this saying that it was.
That's why I'd like to try to ascertain that at this point and find out whether we have enough information today or if we in fact have to send them back to obtain more information.
But, you know, she's getting on to me about asking questions about this stuff. Apparently it's fine with her.
Donald, I ask as many questions as you do. That is absolutely untrue. I have a problem with you making accusations against the company, against the auditors, against Bill, or anyone else. They're just untrue because you're placating to the citizens of Hardy County when we have a responsibility also to foster this investment. That's what I have a problem with. So if you can set all of the little politics aside that you're trying to play, and let's discuss the project and the findings and leave the editorials out of it, we would get a lot further in these meetings.
I'll ask whatever questions I want.
I've never said that you can't ask.
Let me tell you something.
I have a problem with your accusation.
If anybody has a problem answering a question about these finances, then that's a problem to me.
I don't think anyone has had a problem, but why don't you ask your questions without prefacing them with accusations?
Like what?
Like saying that money has been misappropriated and things like that.
That's possible.
Travis, if I may ask you some questions. Starting from a macro standpoint, how much money would you say has been invested by the IDA and yourself, other entities, into this project today?
Somewhere in the neighborhood of $11 million.
We can't hear you, sir.
11 million.
So, relative to, how do you feel about that?
Well, I think that's wonderful. But I don't think that I'll get, she'll get on to me. So go ahead.
I'm trying. If you mentioned that they didn't have skin in the game, how did we get from 7.25 to 11? If there is no skin in the
I
game,
think they
you
should.
have the out.
I think they should have skin in the game, and apparently they have,
And it's-
which is a
We
wonderful
agree,
thing.
Donald, we agree.
Well, what I'm saying is the questions on this report, why should we reimburse them or allow those costs? It wasn't our fault that these questions and stuff come up. It was their record keeping, their bookkeeping, and all that is the problem.
The contract called for draw requests. The board's position was that they were not going to shackle Mr. Bond coming here every month with his handout. He had to make long-term commitments for the expenditure of this money in order to develop the product that was developed. It was not ever intended to be a reimbursement-based draw contract. We attempted and finally did so, move it to where the draws that were made were based on reimbursement requests. But initially, they were not.
Well,
But during that period of time, there were underbillings that seemed to offset a large portion of those overbillings that occurred as a result of estimated draw requests. It's no more complex than that.
well, I think this could have been dipped in the bud in the beginning of these contracts.
How are we gonna go back and do?
I'm fixing to tell you. If we had had audits from day one, instead of agreed on procedures, all these things that Mr. Carter found, these questions and stuff, would have been found in the beginning and not wait until the end to find out we've got a disagreement or a problem or a misunderstanding.
Have a disagreement on 300 and some odd thousand,
But-
$7.25 million. That's not a very large number.
Well, if we'd have had audits in the beginning, instead of voting down audits in the past, this would have been found out and stopped and refigured and redone and got straightened out in the beginning.
We began this examination audit, or examination procedure, forgive me, or whatever it is, 1 year after Continuum took over the project.
Well, we have yet to have an audit on this project. We have yet to have an audit
You
on this
have-
project.
You have an examination.
That's right, which is not an audit.
I yield.
Is an examination an audit?
The examination is very similar to an audit, except we don't go in and test internal controls and the other company, but we do go back to supporting documentation, just like an audit. And actually, we tested 43% of the total expenditures, which is normally more than we would test in an audit. Normally, we would take a sample that is smaller than that to test.
Is the best way to really reconcile all this is to have a forensic audit?
Well, I think, that may be, if I may interject, Mike, if we have a forensic audit, we're pretty much going to determine that there were some draw request estimates, projections that are not exact. That was the purpose of it. We're also going to find that some months are fairly close. But we're also going to find that some of his spreadsheet computations for overhead were too high. We have those identified for us today. We're also going to find that he had underbillings that weren't recognized, and we're going to find that he put about $4 million extra into the project, above what we gave him.
Okay, I can see.
What is a reasonable way to reconcile that and to put these, what is your total number of employees today here?
Number 32 starts in the morning at Tech Road.
So we have our objective, we have 32 Hardee County souls, I guess for the most part, that are working here in Hardee County. What is that annual payroll?
It's well over $1 million,
Is that full-time position?
nearly all in one.
I mean, there's not that many cars out there, Travis.
Well, I can't help that, but we run 24/7 shifts too, so some people are allowed to work from home during the night and weekend shifts.
And they're full-time, all of them full-time?
I believe most of them are, when I say most, probably 80 to 90%. I think there's only just 2 part-times that I know about. Part-time nurse over the weekend, and one of our long-term people had a baby and ended up opting to do part-time work instead of full-time, so she stayed with the people. But, those are real dollars we're paying out.
Okay, I
Those are
agree.
real employees that all work here, and the model continues to prove itself out that nearly every new hire for this corporation ends up working in Hardee County.
Okay, now, and this is just for a matter, now that building out there is considered a technology park. I guess it's supposed to be for technology purposes and stuff like that. Now, these people that you're hiring, are they doing technology work, or are they doing call center work? I mean,
They're doing clinical coordination work, so they are interfacing with technology, but using a clinical skill set to perform that. So they are gathering records, and they're now coordinating those records with other providers and patients to create a common communications platform that's patient-centric. So no different than Sarah sort of operates as your care sync for your board, that you have a group of people that work for you to keep you all in sync with your minutes, with your documents, with your website. We do the same thing from a clinical perspective, but instead of us having an IDA, as you have staff to do it, our staff does it on behalf of the patient, of which now the federal government
Did you say last month that you have a contract with Obamacare?
Well, it's kind of hard to get to see him, so we're using a small organization called CMS, which runs all of Medicare and Medicaid for the United States. They had created a code that is specific to chronic care management. That's CPT code 99490, and that was created as a result of, I think, some of the initiatives of Obamacare. The beauty of the code is that it really validates everything that we've said for 3 years on this project. That if you allow patients to have their records, and if you create a focus that's on them instead of just the providers, which are a fragmented audience, then you will reduce costs. And the pilots that existed in 2013 and 2014 in 429 rural environments that CMS ran as a pilot indicated that there was a positive return on the government's investment, that they would pay someone to coordinate the care for people that had chronic diseases. So those are the same functions that we have been training our staff, as well as building a platform that if printed out would still be about a 40-story building if we printed out the software code on 8.5 by 11 paper. Those two things come together to meet the government's initiative to control spiraling costs in healthcare. We spend over $8,000 per human soul in the United States in healthcare a year for about a $3 trillion spend. And we're just beating out the spend in terms of life longevity. And the nearest next person in the European community spends about $3,500. So our costs are out of control. This is a cost control measure. But I think I'd like to point out on benefit of the project is that, LifeSync as well as Continuum and LifeDash recognize that this shift to clinical transparency, the irony is that we agree on some aspects of transparency, have ultimate benefit not just to the patient, but to the government who supports those payment plans. If we had not invested and done what we have done for the last 2 years, we would be in no position to take advantage of a code that very few vendors can do right now. So the validity of the project is so over-substantiated in its value, not just by myself, but institutional investors, and those investors who want to even come in and put more money into the project. But I will tell you, it's somewhat discouraging that we're still being crucified, for a lack of a better word, over the building phase of this project. And I think that if you ask Clifton Larson, we were not short on receipts. We have submitted thousands of pages of documents in the examination. So we did not lack in evidence. We just sometimes disagree on what some of the dollars were spent on.
Mike, you had proffered that a macro reconciliation of total cost was feasible. How detailed is that?
Like I said, what I envisioned would be that Mr. Bond's CPA prepare financial statements demonstrating the total amount spent from either September or October 2012 to June of 2014. Compare that to $7.25 million that draw requests that were paid out, and then the board can decide. And I don't know what that number is going to be. I know Travis has said that it's been $4 million more than what's been received so far. I think as of June, it could range anywhere from $750,000 to $1 million and a quarter. But either way, it's going to be substantially more than what you paid out.
Do you object to that?
I do not.
How difficult would it be for you to initiate that process at this point in time with Mr. Bond's CPA and provide that for us?
That would be Mr. Bond's CPA preparing financial statements. That wouldn't be us. And that would,
Can you participate in the third-party independent review of those financial statements?
what do you mean by
Well,
third-party independent?
if his CPA is providing financial statements, how will we prove that they are in fact valid and true and honest and whatever's necessary?
I would anticipate that you would rely on the fact that the independent, well, I guess the CPA is not independent, because of the bookkeeping, that the professional would be preparing those financial statements based on actual numbers that they're given.
I would add to that there's a general attestation of anyone who is independently, boarded by the state of Florida as a practicing CPA. That there's a certain level of integrity regardless of who's paying them, that they have to, be certain that they are preparing them according to the rules and professional regulations of the trade. I think, in all fairness to Clifton Larson, there is infinitely more data than a typical sample size would have. Even in the first 3 months of the project, 75% of those estimated withdrawal advances were actually tested. So sampling actually skews its way before we even came to an agreement between our company and the IDA as to the format for the draw request. So I think just a little quick history lesson is that our agreement was not even finally signed until November 20th, which we were still working out the format to which the draw requests would be completed in. And so we didn't vote on that until it was either, I think it was in the December meeting as to what the format would be. And then we were retroactively recreated September, October, November, December on the 31st of December to the agreed upon format that was outlined in section 4. And even by their own examination, you will find, and let's not sort of lose meaning of this, that 95% of our estimates were dead on. That's an A in any class, college course, or any sort of grading scale I know about. The other 5% is easily extinguished in any other way that you want to look at it. Whether we complete a January draw, whether we submit a new February, or a March, or an April, or a May, or a June. All of this came from outside money. Please understand that our corporation has spent millions of dollars. All that money is now coming here from outside investors. That's a substantial investment from this company now back that you are seeing as a return on your investment for the first 3 years to build this project up. And I would ask that you prayerfully consider on how you as a board can help foster our organization to bring external investors into this community, feel welcome to continue to invest what would surely be a surge in hires here to do what we can to be a market leader in this space, because this space represents a $16 billion new sector in healthcare. That rivals even your phosphate trade.
Did you say that November was when you actually became a company or something, or what was the November thing?
November 20th is when the agreement between Continuum and the IDA was signed.
Okay. So the advance in October, was that advance to LifeSync or Continuum?
That was to continue.
And that was before we even signed the contract with it?
That was before you signed the contract, but it was
Okay.
not before the contract date. The contract was dated October,
Okay, well, how are we gonna try to reconcile the licensing thing, where Mr. Bond pays Mr. Bond for the licensing and other things of that nature in there?
well, that's up to the board. That, and Mr. Bond is much more familiar with it than I am, but from our perspective, again, I read you what our engagement was supposed to do. The scope of our engagement was to test that the expenditures on the draw request were supported by by actual expenditure, or the payments on withdrawals were supported by actual expenditures. When we looked at, I believe it was Life Dash, there weren't actual expenditures that supported that charge for the licensing fee that were incurred during the contract period. Those expenditures were incurred before the contract period. That was an investment that Mr. Bond had made in that software, and that licensing fee was for the use of that software. Now, granted, it threw a monkey wrench in it when the contract moved over to Continuum and they became a related party. But if it had been an arm's length transaction, if it hadn't been a related party, then that would be standard industry practice to charge a licensing fee for the use of that software. So it's really up to you to decide if you think that's a legitimate business expense or not.
Travis, maybe we should back up. I'd like to make certain that everyone understands the platform of LifeDash and its importance to this project, how it came about, when it was developed, outside investor. If you can give us some detail, I think it will help.
And I think it's important because it's played a role throughout the project, and it accelerated, Blue Water's business model to build their model for distributing emergency contact information to emergency responders. It accelerated their development. So let's take a familiar platform. It's called Facebook. So, or your Apple phone. Either one, there are platform technologies to where you can build a thing that then plugs on. Building the thing takes a lot less effort than building the infrastructure. No different than your Commerce Park. As its drainage systems, its bridges, its utilities, etc., it's easier to build a building once there are roads and ways to service with power, drainage, water, etc. The building. So the buildings are apps, if you will, in your Commerce Park. The existence of LifeDash came about when we recognized that a lot of us were interacting in a virtual environment. And that virtual environment was more of a wild, wild west in that there were lots of concerns, if you will look back in literature in 2008 and 9 about Facebook not protecting one's privacy. That there was a sense that your grandmother could post something and everybody would see it, and vice versa was true. And then there was no walled gardens in terms of being able to create subgroups. And we thought at LifeDash this was an opportunity to create a semi-private social platform that was geared more to those who are conscious about online reputation, as well as what's called personas. So I know Mike professionally. We do not know each other outside of professional realm. I will only have interactions with him that are professional in nature. That is our persona. And so LifeDash duplicated the human behavior of personas. That platform took a few $1 million to build and a few years to do it. And it had other outside investors than just myself. So we built Blue Water on top of it. We then acquired Blue Water and turned Blue Water into Kerosene. All the while, it's still running on the LifeDash roads, plumbing, sewer, electric, so forth. Then, in order to give new investors a level of added security in the investment, we sold them the roads, sewer, pipe, and all underneath. So they did not want to just own the building for failure that the landowner could evict them. And so in that realm, that's called intellectual property. And those property rights, no different than real estate, the intellectual. And so Continuum then acquired LifeDash. And LifeDash basically gave its intellectual property and its investments to Continuum to further the project.
So, in layman's terms, as you have done a good job of describing, the platform upon which all of the software initially for Blue Water and today Kerosene is based on this pre-existing LifeDash product that you had developed with 4 or 5 other investors prior to ever coming to Hardee County.
That is true.
So when you were not involved in the Blue Water project, it was not a related party transaction that would cause increased scrutiny. But when the assignment and modification agreement came about, it became a related party transaction. Would there have been any reason to say, well, there's other platforms, we can just throw this one away and go pick up another one?
Yeah.
This platform is proprietary to this product.
Extraordinarily so.
Would there have been a way to say to the other investors, well, now that I'm taking over the project, I can't continue to bill you the licensing fee because it looks bad? Maybe not that it's appropriate, but it looks bad. How would they have felt?
Probably no different than a family member building a house on another family member's property. They would say, we still buy the property. It's nice that we're now related, and I appreciate you wanting to move in on our lots and be closer to us, but still, in fact, we have an investment cost in the property, and we expect a return on that property. And the same was to go for LifeDash. LifeDash was not designed to be a single application focus. It was built on a business model to our investors and those who worked on the project, including developers who have stock options and other forms of incentives to work harder than what we pay them, is that this platform would allow other applications to run on it, and we would basically charge them a lease or a licensing agreement. It's just we use different terminology in intellectual property world, but it still follows the norm of real estate property world. And so yes, our investors and the platform expected that it would license space on its platform to applications or buildings, and that it would continue to be a multi-tenant dwelling, and that it would support other applications. The unforeseen circumstances of this project, though, is that in order for this project to succeed, it took 110% of everyone's bandwidth. So LifeDash had no bandwidth to attract other people other than Kerosene. Everyone in our organization from top to bottom worked on this project, so in detriment to those who invested under a thesis thinking that this was going to host multiple applications. In reality, it did not pan out that way, as Kerosene became such an enormous project. And so those investors in LifeDash,
If they spent $2 million on the development of LifeDash and you received $130,000 in licensing fee from Kerosene and Blue Water, they would still have a substantial amount of investment that they had not recaptured. So, and you told us sometime a year and a half ago that you were putting all of the assets of LifeDash into Kerosene. How do those other investors feel about that today?
We negotiated them taking stock in Continuum in lieu of any claims against their investments in LifeDash. So basically, our investors were able to be convinced that the value of Continuum would be greater than LifeDash, and so therefore, no cash changed hands, they just took stock options in Continuum.
I have one last question then. How integral is LifeDash platform to Kerosene products certification or approval by the federal government?
It's essential, but it can be like grafting a new orange tree together with one that produces sweeter fruit. I mean, they're genetically entwined. There's no way down to get the two apart. And without the platform in the way that it communicates securely with its electronic communications platform, which is secure messaging, blue button, and direct method, those things are at the heart of the LifeDash platform. Continuum would have had to have built them themselves. And it's not just the amount of money that it takes to build these things, it's the time to market. So it would have been a substantial increase of repeat construction at the software level if we did not have the advantage of the LifeDash platform domain.
How many other products today have the same recognition by the federal government that are on the market in competition with kerosene?
We only know of 3 other companies who have come out to say that they will compete with, or that they will go after this market. One is MD Revolution, the other one is Careflex. Yes, the other one is EQ Health out of Louisiana. For a $16 billion market, that's not a lot of competition. MD Revolution is a relatively small company, less than 20 employees out of California. EQ Health is out, whether they legally be able to build the code. And we're waiting for, we're waiting for an opportunity for those to see if they're brave enough to build EQ Health. Careflex, as far as we can tell, is vaporware. None of the links on the page actually go to any downloadable code. But they are a $100 million funded EMR parent company. So we expect that they'll evolve into a CCM module. Our window of opportunity is ideal. There is, in retrospect, there is no hand we could have played better in that we leveraged all that we had towards the opportunity to take advantage of those who felt a patient-centered healthcare transparency model had benefit in reducing costs. And so we now have a position to where we are now working with a new series of institutional investors which feel that kerosene truly could be a market leader. And if that is the case, what I'm here to encourage you about, and not to confuse our conversation, is that we are an organization that's trying to build hundreds upon hundreds of employees in this town. Because those who want to make kerosene a market leader, they look at the rate limiting step of onboarding human beings and getting them trained. And so anything that is counter to hiring new people actually reduces the velocity to which we grow, which is counter to the first 8 pages of our agreement as to why we're here in terms of economic development.
So I think kind of back to the discussion that I believe Donald brought up on the API, and I don't know if this is the opportune time that the board wants to take up the debate on whether or not we want to have discussion on whether or not we are going to allow that or disallow that, or if we want to look at another measure. Is there any other input from board members or direction on those issues?
Madam Chair, I think as a matter of record, we should request the financial statements from their CPA, as Mr. Carter suggested. Certainly, I just think it will take away from this evaluation process. Probably this could be procured in the next 30 days. It shouldn't be that onerous to produce. And I would like for that to be presented to the board, or at least attached to our responses, or at least maybe to your, when you find the answer, or whatever the process is going to be with your examination.
Well, I think, again, it comes down to the question is, did Mr. Bond say, for the sake of argument, spent $8.25 million on this and received $7.25 million, and the question cost could be whittled down to, say, a couple $100,000. With that couple $100,000, should he get credit for the extra $1 million he spent to more than offset the $200,000 that might be questioned? I think that's what it comes down to. Because I think what you're going to find is that Mr. Bond did spend a substantial amount more during the contract period than what was received in draw payments.
Well, you know, I raised this point at the last meeting, regardless of what the board decides to do. I would like to, I kind of made a few last minute suggestions on where we should go from here, and maybe we should cover that now relative to this. We should begin a new discussion regarding contract modifications that address all of the items in section 4 of the assignment modification agreement. including restated job creation goals, protections against the company exiting Hardy County as it grows successfully. For me and others, we've had discussions, and I think that's probably our greatest nightmare today, is that this company is going to have tremendous success, and they're going to leave. And we certainly haven't, I won't say that, but I would like some additional contemplation of commitment from your company and the other folks that you are working with on their allegiance and commitment to the citizens of Hardy County. We need some definition of some type of remuneration obligation, not necessarily to obligate you, but when are you ever reconciled? I mean, if you end up producing a total of $50 million in payroll that goes into Hardy County and you eventually sell the company, what obligation do you have to us at that point in time? I don't know that we can retroactively define those things, but I think it would be wise to try to do that at this point. And I don't see that there's any resistance on Mr. Bond's part to not try to address those circumstances. So I again would like to have an opportunity to sit down and provide some clarification for the board and the citizens on where we go from here. I also would say that we really have this company going in the right direction, and we need to be very thankful for that.
I would second that. I'm not a voting member, but I will tell you that from our perspective, I understand that there are those who have opinions one way or another about this project. But there are 32 people starting in the morning, 31 currently, that draw payroll from our corporation. I think we've been very good stewards of your money. And I think that we have matched that in kind and will surpass our investment in 2015 with outside capital. I think despite those who are that psychologically need a lot of attention, when you look at it from a business case, this is a giant success. And as a result, I think that Hardy County should be celebrating, and I think that it should be embracing and encouraging others to work in healthcare inside Hardy County. And because I still believe in the model. And I think, our company is committed at every level to continue to invest in this town, because this is where we built our services headquarters. There is no alternate site. And so all of our skill sets, all of our intellectual property on how we do things are based in Neck River. And so the more that we can do as a town to welcome the fostering of that, and the more that we then bring on new people, and when I talk about new people, I'm talking about organizations that are worth billions of dollars, visit, I'd like for them to feel welcome, frankly. Because my job as a CEO is to foster in front of them a business model that incents them to invest dollars, because they'll eventually have a return on investment. The byproduct of that is creating jobs where people can go to school, graduate from high school or college, and still live here. Or they live on the outskirts, they drive, to Tech River, they eat on Main Street, and they gas up across the street. These are the things that were fundamental to the project. These are the things, unfortunately, that have not gotten the due attention that they are due. Because every dollar we spend here does have a multiplier effect in economic development. All of these hires have gone through Harlan Workforce. We've abided by that. And we'll continue to help them grow in terms of their understanding of how to work technical jobs. And I would just lastly say something that we're doing that we didn't say that we were going to do, but we know that it's in the best interest of our company, is that we're going to certify all our employees to be certified nursing assistants. That is a skill set now that they will have that will last on their resumes and will give them job security in the event that they want to change jobs. And so I think that we'll continue to comply. I would caution you, though, that recognizing that we have spent well in excess of 6 figures on this examination ourselves, within time or direct CPA fees. That's time we're not building the company. And then I would just lastly encourage you to the fact that the more that you can do to show that despite any differences we may have in the philosophy of the project, Tom, that there are those who want to build careers here. And they have feelings and families, and they serve churches and schools with you in this town, and they don't want to really feel like the redheaded stepchildren. And I was just bringing it back to the point, it would be very hard to build a large corporation here if they do feel like redheaded stepchildren.
Mr. Carter, coming back to what you were looking for with the financial statements, from Continuum CPA, what months were you looking for specifically as far as reconciliation?
You could either start in September or October. I know operations started mid-September. My understanding is there wasn't much activity first half of the month. So we could start in October 1. I don't think the end is going to really make any difference in the outcome. We'll see that over the contract period through 2014 that there was a lot more spent on the project than what we paid out.
So you're looking for that, basically to run from October to June of 2014.
October of 2012 through June of 2014.
If I could give a slight adjustment to that based upon just how the draws have been in the using the documents we've already run, if we could take that from September 10th of 2012 to June 30th, then at least we'll be able to reuse a lot of the work that we've already done in terms of how we run the system reports.
One other point of note that should be, I'd like to note in this meeting is that there was a remainder on the LifeSync closeout of $58,500 and some odd dollars. And that money was spent within the Blue Water project. It was not transferred to Continuum Lands. And we know that, for certain.
So, I think what the discussion at hand is if Mr. Bond and his CPA provide some certified financial statements, you're willing to review them, to make sure that, we're not asking you to complete an audit or examination of those, but to ensure that they line up with what you have seen, the expenses of the company. What do you feel like you would need to do additionally? You receive that information to verify that for us, because as you mentioned, this is his CPA. Do you have the ability to verify that information based on what you have already reviewed?
We couldn't give any sort of attestation on that without doing the work, and I don't know if there's any really point to doing more work. We can look at it and tell you what we think, but we can't issue any kind of report without doing any substantiation of it.
Mike, what confidence level do you have relative to, you have stated, but how certain are you that Mr. Bond and his other entities have put more money into the project than we gave them? From your observation, from your examination?
Well, there's actually addition to procedures in addition to the examination that were requested, but we have received bank statements from Continuum, from Live Dash, and from Bond Medical, and, or not from Bond Medical, I'm sorry, Live Dash and Continuum. And just based on the bank statements that we saw, it was at least $773,000 at least. And I think there was some discussion of another $200,000+, so it's around $1 million, but at least with the $773,000 more based on those bank statements. And I think there was also some additional things from Bond Medical that weren't included in that.
I think we did have some dialogue about that at last month's meeting where I asked Tricia, and you did mention that you reviewed bank statements in excess of what that had been customary for the project continued. So, that, gave you some level of confidence that, that without auditing and reviewing that all of those expenditures continued in the subsequent months. Is that accurate?
There was bank statement activity, and we were provided, monthly financial statements out of the QuickBooks, Mr. Bond's QuickBooks program. And that's where the difference of $200,000 came from. We just based on actual activity with bank statements, and we found that there was at least $773,000 more paid out than what was received in draw request.
Okay. Now, you rather we find somebody else to do what she's wanting to do? Another CPA firm?
Certainly welcome to.
That's the feeling I get.
I just know what my professional obligations are, and I can't just look at a set of financial statements that are compiled and say, yeah, it's all there. I mean, I can't professionally do that.
Right, understand.
But you think the best course of action to remedy, rather than go item by item through every question cost, is to review the investment in total that was made by the financial statements?
I believe that if your objective was to make sure that what you paid out was advancing the project, yes. I think that would be overall the best way, rather than getting in the weeds and looking at every individual difference that we found and talking about the 30 pages of items in the back of that report that we issued. Because if you went back to that slide that showed the breakdown, slide 48, I believe it is. Say the $44,000 goes away because it's offset by underbillings for that month, and the last item is the licensing, the $36,000. If you agree that was a necessary business expense, that goes away. Then you're not really left with that much money, that much difference, especially when you consider that there's $7.25 million that's paid out. So if Mr. Bond can demonstrate that he paid out a substantial amount more than what is questioned up there, then I think that should give you confidence that your money did go toward the project and it did go toward the advancement of the project.
Mike, you may not be able to answer this. If this board allows all this, and some other agency comes in down the road and turns up the heat of what was done, who's going to take the brunt of it, you or the management or the board?
Ultimately, it's the board's decision. You're welcome to look at what we did. Like I said, we tested 43% of the total expenditure, which is substantially more than what we were testing at all. Those were the results of that test. It's up on the board right there.
What would you normally test in a similar examination, and then what would you proffer as a remedy for any question cost?
I've seen question cost handled all across the board. I've seen agencies demand full payment. I've seen agencies forgive. One instance I can remember forgive $2 million of an embezzlement when the agency actually received $1 million of insurance money and compensation for that. So it's all across the board what state and federal agencies do. But in this instance, I would imagine that the state agency would say, how much did you spend in total on the project, and how does that compare to what we paid you? And if you spent more than what we paid you, then they wouldn't disallow those costs.
That's the pleasure of the board. Well, my only challenge, and I don't disagree with Bill's recommendation that it would be good for us to have that information, but I do still think that we have some questions, you know. Personally, I have a bit of a problem with us directing them to do anything further if we're not gonna debate and have a decision on whether or not we feel that is gonna remedy the question cost and resolve for us as a board the question of allowed, disallowed. You know, I don't want either entity to waste any more time on going through, you know, popping down a bunny trail if we're not going to consider that or accept that, or if we want to have the debate in another way. So I think that we do need to have dialogue on whether we all feel as a board that that is the direction we want to go before we, you know, direct Mr. Bond or anyone else to spend any additional time or money in providing information for those costs. So if the board is in agreement that that is the way we want to address or reconcile or close out the examination portion of the contract, you know, then we can request that information.
All is involved in getting those financial statements. Basically getting a key on the computer and printing them, or
Mr. Bonds, whoever the CPA that he hires would take his financial statements that are generated, or the financial information that are generated in his system, and would put it in the form of financial statements, a balance sheet, and a profit and loss statement, an income statement. And then I know a substantial amount of what Mr. Bond spent has actually been capitalized, so you won't see it as an expense, but you would need to look at the expenses that were incurred and the amount that's been capitalized and add those two amounts together to see the total investment in this project.
What is the obligation of his CPA in this equation?
It depends on the type of engagement. If it's a compilation, the CPA would just be putting that financial information in the form of financial statements and not be making any other forms of assurance on it. If it's a review, then the CPA would put it in the form of financial statements and would be giving a negative assurance that he's not aware of any material misstatements. And if it's an audit, then it would be giving a statement that the financial statements are fairly stated in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles.
So if you had a recommendation for the form of those financials to be presented to us, what would it be formal?
I think at this point, I mean, as Mr. Bond stated, he's already spent a lot of money, a lot of time. We've already looked at thousands of documents. I would think that if you just had a compilation and just saw what the numbers were, that would give you a good idea of what has been spent on the project during the contract period.
And you're saying that because you have a review based on, I mean, you have a level of confidence in that based on what you've seen during the review process as far as documentation?
I'm saying that because we have already tested 43% of the expenditures of loan draw requests, and we have looked at bank statements and information out of the QuickBooks, you know, for the entire contract period.
Up to June 2014.
Right, through June 2014.
Again, believe we should do that.
that's basically what you want to do.
I know at some point we need to let him proceed on down the road and develop his company, but at this point I think we need to have that one more before we can make a decision based upon
Well, if you're gonna make a motion to do this, and I'm not against it, but I think your motion, if you're gonna include CLA, you need to make sure they want to do it before you put them on the spot.
We can't do that.
I think what they're
For a lot of
saying is
reasons.
certifying statements from Mr. Bond's CPA.
Right. Right.
certified
That's what-
statements
Yes.
that,
It will come with, an accountant's report, compilation report, and the financial statements report, accompany that report.
Then the real issue is that, is the data going to be satisfactory to reconcile the differences? Will you accept? I have a word for whatever
Like
this
to
is.
see what it's,
Well, if his compilation shows that he did in fact put more money into the project than he received from us, is that going to be adequate for the board to accept the differences in the question costs?
not for me, it's
If you would tell me exactly how you would like to reconcile this, I would attempt to do that, but I'm not certain how to do
Well, I think we should disallow the call.
that. Okay? On what basis? Just because they found them and questioned them?
Well, I think this speaks for itself.
How does it speak for itself? They are questioned costs. They are not costs, they are costs that have circumstances around them. Doesn't mean they're illegitimate. So how do you unilaterally say every one of them it should be disallowed? On what basis?
Well, maybe
I'm
not.
good with that. If you could go,
Well, maybe not every one of them should. I do question when you charge 15%, but you only spend 10% on overhead and stuff like that. There's a lot of questions in this thing that are just not
but
answered.
even in
about
doing
money,
that,
about money.
he's saying that, yes, he charged a flat rate, it was excessive, but the money that came through the draw was actually spent with other expenditures that we have a record of.
Well, see.
They don't count?
No,
Why?
because it wasn't part of the contract. You don't take money and do something, but that's questionable with the money, Bill.
If the
And you
draw
want to be
request-
reimbursed for it because you know.
okay, let me ask another question, Donald. If, so let's say that we went that route. We said, we're gonna disallow these costs.
Yes.
Had we done that as you proffered before during the project on a month-to-month basis, would you agree that that money would have still been in the grant for them to draw on for costs that we agreed were not question costs?
If this thing had come out zero and said everything was great, then we wouldn't be going into this. But this thing is.
I agree,
50 or
but-
100 pages of question cost of stuff. And we just can't overlook that.
So what I'm saying is, if we had done this on a month-to-month, and we said this month, we're not gonna allow these costs, that money would have been left in the grant for them to draw on.
Well, probably what would have happened, that when Mr. Bond come before this board every month for a draw request, nobody on our staff had looked at any of this stuff. We just accepted it as fact. Nobody went
I
through the record.
beg to differ with you on that.
Then why didn't you catch this?
Because the draws are estimates, they're not precise reimbursements.
That's what I'm saying.
Well, there'd have been no way with a startup company that was taking over a project to have precise draw requests from reimbursements.
Well, what was-
Every month, he's ramping up. He added 12 or 15 new employees here in Hardin County. We had no idea how the expenses were going to be partitioned out between us and them relative to Tech River. He was guessing with projections, and it was allowable under the contract. It's no different. Most financing projects allow for initial draws, and they evolve into reimbursement.
Well, according to our CPA here, it was not allowable. It should have been reimbursed.
No, that's not what they're saying. They're just saying that these are
It's
question
not
costs.
allowable, it's questionable.
That in the CPA world, they did not have the documentation to justify in its entirety. So they're not saying that it's allowed or disallowed. They're saying these are the things we think you should look more into as a board.
Well, what was
So
it?
if we just unilaterally said, okay, we're gonna take that total and we're not going to allow it, the money would have still been left in the draw. I think we've all agreed that their payroll has been something we've given consideration to this entire time, right? Salaries being paid to their staff. That's something that's easy to prove, easy to verify. So had the money still been there in January and the contract was extended to June, we would consider those costs, the payroll, let's just say payroll for argument purposes, let's just say payroll alone, for him to continue to make draws based on his payroll. Would you say that's fair?
You better say that again.
So if we would have disallowed these costs along the way, and month to month, like you're talking about, in January, he would have still been left with all of that money.
If these costs had been disallowed in the beginning, we wouldn't be going through this.
Well, we
It
would
was-
still be,
it was-
I think we
it would have been straight.
7.25 balance to 7.25.
We-
Spent.
and we would still be going through an audit and review process. I don't think any of us
We
has
haven't
ever,
went through an audit.
has ever said that we don't think that we should go through some sort of reconciliation at the end of this project. What I'm trying to say is, had the money been handled that way and disallowed along the way, he would have still had that in January of 2014 to draw on. The expenses have continued since then and increased because staff has increased. So if you're saying that you propose we disallow all of those costs,
Yes.
are you saying that you think we should consider costs from January to June, which are not currently being considered in this review? Because the contract is still in place through June, he still maintained the payroll, nobody was laid off, the project continued and launched, marketing continued. What are you comfortable accepting? Had the money been rejected then, it would have still been there. So do you think it's fair to say that we should consider some of his investment toward that?
No.
That's where I think we need to understand why you feel that way.
Because I read this. This is what tells me. It tells me everything that CLA put in here. It says, these are questions. This is some things like the licensing thing, that we should get some kind of a business development person to look at this stuff. There's other things in there that we recommend that you look at get somebody else that's more expertise in these things to look at this. There's a lot more in here than just dollars.
So you think, and rather than just consider his payroll for the last 6 months, that we should maybe pay a couple $100,000 to someone to review the project in its entirety to see if our money was well invested?
What is money to us? The way we throw money around? What's $100,000 or $200,000?
So is that what you're proposing?
I'll make a motion to have whatever, a forensic audit or whatever if you want me to.
Do you have any idea what a forensic audit is going to cost? Do you have any idea?
Did you just hear what I said?
Yeah, do you know
The way we throw
how much
money
would
around?
how much would a forensic audit cost in this case, please?
I would,
It would
I would
have
hate to throw a number out, but it's probably gonna cost, is almost as much as what the question costs are.
Exactly.
But
Yeah. 100,000, 200,000?
I guess
We throw that much money away monthly.
the consideration is though, that the contract.
How do you say that?
Yeah, I would like to know
Where have we thrown money away? I don't really understand how you sit on this board and make a statement like that. You said we throw that much money away monthly.
Well, that was just a figure of speech, Bill. But we do spend a lot of money. It's just like the incubator thing down there. We have no contracts with those people down there. I think it's $8,000 a month for the light bill and stuff like that. I mean, we need to this board needs to take control of this board.
We need to stay on task, and this is exactly what I'm referring to when you make these wild, random accusations, and I don't know where you're coming up with this.
Well, I don't know where you're coming up with it just to allow all this stuff.
I'm not saying I'm allowing anything. I'm trying to have a
You're
reasonable
hammering me.
debate with, I'm asking you questions. You're the one that sits here and says if anybody here doesn't want to be asked questions, there's an issue with that.
And I just give you the answer 3 or 4 times. This is what tells me to disallow. This right
That,
here.
does this report tell Donald Samuels to disallow these costs?
That report just says those are the costs that we question.
Are they disallowed?
that's the board decision.
So Donald, where do you get from question costs that they're disallowed?
Well, we can go over one by one if you want to. It may take a couple of days. But they're in here. You need to read this.
Once again, I've read it at length. I've studied it. I've gone back. I've asked Mr. Bond questions directly. I've asked Bill questions directly. Have you done any of that?
Who?
You. Have you asked anyone outside of these board meetings?
No, I do my talking on this point right here just like you should.
Which is why you don't seem prepared for some of these debates.
Now, you need to do your talking to the public, not behind closed doors.
I probably spend 20 hours a month at minimum getting up to speed and understanding all of this.
Well,
And I'm not retired, so I don't have any intention to stay here for 24 hours in a month. I'm sorry, Jean, go ahead.
Whenever you're talking about the billing and excess of expenses, is that total expenses or just maybe in one category you getting,
The billing, is that, there were two sets of overhead that were charged on the contract, on the draw request. One was for general expenses, 15% of salaries were to cover general expenses. Discussions with Mr. Bond, just because he said administratively it was a lot easier to do rather than to try to put every single $5 invoice on there.
in other words, it could be that maybe it was claimed under one expense and it was spent in a different category?
Well, again, we had a detail that we received from Mr. Bond, what made up that actual overhead expenses for the months that we tested. And we tested, about 70% of those total expenses. And we came up with a different number, but we still came up with overbilling amount for those months. But again, I guess I just would suggest that instead of getting caught up in the weeds, the contract ran through June of 2014. Mr. Bond was spending about $300,000 a month. The last draw that was paid out was a partial month that was only $56,000 that was paid in January 2014 for December expenses. So Mr. Bond went essentially 7 months of additional expenses that could be applied to this contract. And if you look at $300,000 a month for 7 months, that's a good bit of money. So the question is, even if you disallow the whole $140,000, would he still be allowed to apply the expenses that he incurred after the draws finished toward the additional money that would be freed up?
If we get the financial statements that we're really going to show us one way or the other.
If you get the financial statements, then you'll have a number that shows you how much he actually spent, and you can compare that to how much he actually received in draws during the contract period.
If this board allows these costs, is that going to be setting a precedent for the future?
I think it's a case by case. When it comes to questioning cost, I think it's a case by case situation. I think you have to take each case as it is and see if the costs that are questioned were legitimately put towards the project or not, or whether they didn't relate to the project and should be reimbursed.
Lord, was that a motion that you made all ago?
Yes.
A second.
Lori, for the record, will you please repeat your motion?
My motion, I think if I remember correctly, was that we would wait until, vote on this until we receive financial statements from Mr. Bond at the next meeting.
And is that the motion that you have seconded, Jean? Do we have any further discussion from board members? Any other comments from our presenters on the matter? Agreeable with all parties?
Yes.
Any other comments from board members? If not, we will open for public comment. Mr. Kirkland?
I think that,
Can't hear you.
they can't hear me, so
Speak up.
speak up.
There, that's better.
You hear me now?
Yeah.
Now you hear me? We have a presentation that we were gonna, several of us present in the little 3-minute thing. This presentation, you will have government, health.gov documents in front of you with highlighted paragraphs and stuff. We'll give you light years more education than what you're getting from Mr. Bond, which does not hand you anything to validate what he's saying. Not saying he's nothing wrong, but he doesn't give you any documentation. I have the documents here today. In 15, 30 minutes, if you guys don't ask too many questions, you will be light years of where you're at right now on knowing what to do with this dilemma you have with this board, and it's related to everything Mr. Bond told you just a while ago. Why you should be had this pocket. Excuse my term, but that's just my opinion. Are you willing to go through that?
Mr. Kirkland, I apologize, but I'm not following you, and I have no clue what you're talking about in the least. Are you asking that you would like to provide us with some documents?
I would like to do a presentation.
A 20-minute presentation to the board?
Well, we should be able to get enough in it by then if you don't want to hear what's going on. You'll be looking at the documents. They'll be in your hand. We even have them on CD.
In reference to what?
On reference to electronic healthcare records. With questions like, if all this stuff, there's only 2 or 3 people involved in this, what he's involved in.
Okay, so is this relevant to this examination? Help me connect the dots.
If you let me finish my sentence, maybe that would help. How in the world, when I stay here and hand you a paper showing that over 90% of the hospitals and doctors in this nation are already using a electronic health record system which is free to the patients. Now, we're going to document it. We're not going to just frank babbling. We're going to give you the documents. Put them in your hand.
Okay, but tie this back to the motion on the table about the examination.
How it ties to it is you guys have a dilemma. You're blowing money out the yin yang trying to come up with had this thing and going on. If you had a 30-minute education, you might think about this thing differently. It'll be up to you guys what decision you make once we give you the facts and data from the federal website on this whole thing, on what he's talking about. I do not see, with what little education I got on it, which is way more further than what he's telling us, I don't see that he would be able to do anything other than develop software if he was qualified and certified and hooked up with them. And if he was, if he'd have showed you those documents, then even that butthole would be a little more happy. He has not produced anything that means anything about anything. And Mr. Carter, no disrespect, but he is paid to try to move this thing out for you guys. and you ain't going nowhere there either. That whole thing, and I think if he tells you the truth, he'll tell you you're not going nowhere. I think he disclaims most everything he does.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kirkland.
Frank, I wouldn't mind listening to your thing, but right now, we're just gonna vote on trying to get more information. I wouldn't mind hearing your presentation, but this vote is.
Okay, well, you know, even if you wanna have a workshop, I've got quite a few hours, a lot of money in this. I've probably got $15,000-$20,000 in ink and paper and money invested in following this county for a long time. And maybe some of the things I've been saying is wrong. But,
Okay, Mr. Kirkland,
but you can have a workshop. We'll come do that.
well, I don't think that your comments are relevant to where we're at in this motion.
Well, then how was Mr. Bond's
So,
comments relative to it?
So
He was
then-
talking about what I'm talking
He's
about.
a presenter, and this is public comment. So I'm going to ask you to take your seat. We're not going to entertain a presentation at this time. But I do appreciate your interest in the project, and I would like to ask that you leave the information so the board can have your information and consider it for a future
If you're
presentation.
not going to allow it public either, blankly.
Okay, then we appreciate your time. Mr. Coleman.
Thank you. Henry Coleman, Bowling Green. Thanks for taking all this time looking at this project. I think we all agree it needs to be reconciled. It needs to be looked at in totality. I do believe and I do know for a fact that the examination procedure that was done did not look at most of this project. It only looked, Mr. Carter is only looking to see if he can find money that says was spent. What it's not looking at, and this is what Mr. Samuels was trying to say. If you submit draw requests or invoices, a detailed list, one level deep from one company to another, hours of work by coders, etc., mentors, down to the nearest tenth of an hour. All of the numbers are down to the nearest penny. And now we're going back and calling these estimates. They were estimates that we didn't know at the time. It was not discovered they were estimates until November 5th of 2014 at a meeting. All of this stuff that happened. It's very clear to me that the approach that should be taken, that had there been somebody, Casey Dixon or somebody that was actually verifying, and this is the point of my 3 minutes right here. You have to verify that every penny was spent for the best purposes under the project, and it actually went toward furthering the project, and it was the best way that that money could have been spent. That's the burden of proof. So when Mr. Carter put together the examination, he did not look to see if there were actually, those hours actually happened. There were no logs. There were no way mentors. There were no records. There were personnel files, training records, any of the stuff. None of the stuff lower than that one level invoice that was detailed to the nearest tenth of an hour, let's say, the nearest penny, that was presented as factual invoices. They were receipts. They were invoices. I want you to pay me this amount of money to this penny for the last month. Now, even if he put that together in January for the first 3 months of the continuing labs, why would those be estimates? He's already booked those expenses. Those expenses shouldn't be estimates. They were put together after the fact. You can't say they were estimates at this point. You certainly can't say at a certain point down the road there was in-kind contributions, and let's just say that a lot of that money put somebody in Bermuda or bought somebody a new car or something, whatever. You made an estimate on a licensing thing or some other investor. You can't do that.
Final comments, Mr. Coleman.
You have to look at the record. And Mr. Carter, what he did was only the first part. Now if someone has to verify, once you say, yes, this amount was spent, then you have to determine, was it spent for the best purposes of the project? That's the burden. That's what you have to do.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Coleman. Do we have any other public comments? Yes, Mrs. Cole?
Hi, I'm Nicole. I don't think we need to put Travis Bond through an additional review or financial statement. When you think about it, he met the requirements of the contract he entered into. The board should have put more, there were no benchmarks for him to meet, there was no real oversight on the monthly distribution. There were no, the contractual obligations were kind of vague. But, and with the 140,000, yeah, in a perfect world, it would all be accounted for. But over $7.25 million, if you're talking about 140,000, it's 1.9%. It's immaterial. But I think going forward, Mr. Bond did exactly what we told him to do. But going forward, we need better contracts, they need to have better oversight, and we need to make sure that they're meeting contractual obligations in, set benchmarks. We want so many employees at this date before more money. Just my opinion.
Thank you, Mrs. Cole. I think we agree with those recommendations. Mr. Chansey?
Donald Chansey, 1224 Pine Drive, Wachita, Florida. I couldn't hear in the back of the room when Mr. Samuels asked Mr. Carter if the heat got turned up, who was ultimately responsible. What was the answer to that question?
Ultimately, that it is the board's oversight.
This board?
Yes.
Okay. Now, it says, and last month, Mr. Carter also said that it was up to the management board to allow or disallow. And it said on here on item number 4, we were going to have a management response. But what I heard was a county employee explaining Mr. Bond's position. I did not hear anything from the management board other than a few questions. So I would like to hear the true management response and not from a county employee. At the last month meeting, I think Mr. Carter said it twice, that if this board, which is a responsible board, didn't do anything, that the Board of County Commissioners was the ultimate responsible party. Is that a true statement?
I didn't say that.
I don't recall that statement being made.
But we can go back and get the tape on that.
I think you should, because I know I didn't make that statement.
Who is the original agreement for the money made with? It's made with the Board of County Commissioners in Mosaic. Has nothing to do with the IDA.
Are you referring to the Mosaic agreement or the
Yes.
Continuum Labs contract?
Well, on that particular, I'm talking about the Mosaic, but I'll skip that because you're not going to allow that. That's fine. Mr. Carter, the 43% that you looked at, what was the total dollar estimated spent of the 43%?
If you would address your questions to the board.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, would you please ask Mr. Carter, when he stated that he looked at the 43% of the spent revenue, approximately how much is that?
How much?
In
It's
dollar
40.
values.
It's 43% of $7.25 million.
No. 43% that he looked at of documents.
He looked at 25%
No,
of
he
the
said he looked
documents,
at
which
40.
accounted for 43% of the overall spent.
We looked at 25% of the draws, and that accounted for
43% of the revenues spent.
$3,092,374.
How much?
$3,092,374.
Okay. Back in the initial contract agreement, was the license agreement with Mr. Bond ever discussed to this board as management? That there was going to be a fee?
The license agreement was included in the original LifeSync contract.
And it was
There was
explaining
a-
how much they were going to get paid for.
That conversation would have happened 3 years ago, so I can't tell you what the conversation of the board was, but I can tell you that if you review the public record, the LifeSync contract includes a schedule that includes the API fee.
Okay, on the sampling that they did, they said they spent 700 hours. How much did that sampling cost it IDA taxpayers, whatever.
Are you asking how much have we spent on the
Just the
audit?
sampling, no, it's not an audit, on the sampling.
Okay, before we address that question, I want to make sure, because we've exceeded your time. Are there any other questions that,
Okay.
let's go ahead and give us
One
all
more-
the questions
two more
and then we'll
things,
address them.
comment. Mr. Grant at the end of the last meeting stood up and said they were a viable company, but they couldn't make it without the cooperation of Hardee County and they can't pay the rent. How are they gonna pay for a certified public accountant? Are they gonna hand you the bill? Number two, I think you really need to applaud the Hardee High School program. Both of my daughters came out of the high school, honors and everything else, but guess what? They also have a CNA program degree. If that's all so special, well then applaud Hardee High School. It is an achievement, but basically it allows you to go work at a nursing home, change bedpans, take blood pressure. If it's all that, thank you very much. Hardee High School does 4 times the numbers that they do.
So I would like to address a couple of your comments and things that you've said, Mr. Chansey.
Okay.
I think that we can answer for how much the audit has cost Hardee County, and then I would like to address the comments that you've made after that. Do you have an updated amount on what we have paid so far for the audit? Currently, we're at roughly $55,000 in expenses on the examination. So does that answer your question on that issue?
On that issue, yes.
Okay. You made reference to statements made by Mr. Bond that he cannot further this company without the partnership of Hardee County. So I want to.
Mr. Grant. Mr. Grant, at the end of the 3-minute section of the last meeting, said he was a viable company, but he couldn't make it without the cooperation and the help of Hardee County, because they can't pay the rent.
I don't think that had anything to do with can't pay the rent. That was not part of that discussion. The issue with their participation in Hardee County is going to very soon be a human capital issue, because they are currently seeking to hire additional jobs in Hardee County, and we're going to reach a point where they're going to have to continue recruiting at a fairly accelerated pace to keep in front of the contracts that they're bringing on board to service their patients. I don't recall, and I'm open to other board members for correction, any comment being made that they can't pay the rent, that wouldn't be a future discussion.
Listen to the end of the tape. Last month.
They're not currently paying rent, but I think that no one has ever said that they can't, aren't willing to, haven't had some discussion on. So I think that you might be misreading that. I'd like to comment also on the CNA program. I don't agree with you that you come out of that program able to change bedpans and whatever else you mentioned. I personally graduated from the CNA program at Hardee Senior High School, and I agree that I'm very proud of that program, and I'm excited that we have students that will graduate high school with the opportunity.
But what does
to
it allow you to do?
I would say that
Let's be
if
honest.
you
What does
come
it allow
out
you
of
to
the
do?
high school with a CNA certification, you have demonstrated medical technology terms, you've tested on that, you've passed state licensing boards that you have to be familiar with, all of those terms and the terminology, and understand basic medical charting, in addition to the clinical aspect, which is what you're referring to. So I think that is an appropriate foundation for this company and what they are trying to
I
do.
applaud them, but they make it sound like it's such a great thing. If that's such a great thing, then applaud Hardee High School.
Well,
You're even a recipient of it.
They're thrilled that Hardee High School has this
I'm glad
program.
you got your CNA. I'm glad my daughter got their CNA.
I don't understand what point you're trying to make in diminishing. I think it is a big deal that we have a private company that is offering to train their staff for free through this program. I think that is a big deal, because there are people in Hardee County that haven't taken advantage of the program as they went through the high school, and they would have to pay
So if this
at
ever
any
fails,
other.
they can go get a CNA job. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I got one comment I want to make. Yes, Mr. Grant did say without the support of Hardee County, Continuum Labs will not make it, and that is true. That's in any place that you want to open up a business and you don't have county support, it's not going to work. With the economic terrorists we have operating in this county, it's going to be very difficult for a business to want to come to Harvey County.
What was it, the API in LifeSync, that was about 600,000 or 1.2 million or something? Is that my question is that the licensing agreement, is that the same thing as the licensing agreement?
I believe that's different.
Is it different?
Mr. Bond can explain it better than I can.
Okay, the reason I'm asking before you answer, Mr. Bond, is that if we paid that money for the licensing fee in the beginning, why would we pay it monthly? So that's why.
No difference than you building a road and then the county charging taxes for the road. It's the same exists. Just because you buy a thing doesn't mean that thing doesn't park meters. So it's the same principle.
But it's the same product though. It's the same thing.
No, the product always evolves, just like you would say.
Well, I know it evolves, especially in technology. It does evolve, that is for sure. But are we talking about the same licensing agreement? Is the API money that we paid out the same licensing product, I guess it is, that we paid monthly?
The API would have been that would be like the initial hookup, like the initial construction. But, you know, as Mr. Vaughn mentioned, there's ongoing, that's not, you know, that's fairly customary in business that if you buy, you know, in the banking industry, if we bought a software to, run our services, and we had to subscribe to ongoing updates and maintenance because we're not getting what we need out of the software. It's you pay the big money up front for the software, but then you have ongoing maintenance if you want to continue utilizing that. From time to time, companies say we're no longer providing updates or maintenance or support, so you need to upgrade to this whole other software package. So this is an ongoing licensing that is now pushed in as part of the project, and it is a part of CareSync now.
That's what I'm asking. Is it the same product with the upgrades that you do monthly or whatever? But it's the same thing. We're talking about the same thing. Is that right or
Yes,
wrong?
we're talking about modifications and upgrades to the API. Right.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to resume public comment. So
Hi, Danielle White, 810 Shady Circle, Wachula. I'm just getting my feet wet in all of this. I've never really heard of grants starting businesses. Usually it's private individuals putting up their money to start businesses. So this is new to me. But I do know that there's an ongoing complexity with this as far as knowing exactly excuse me, where the money has gone to. And I think the question is going to continue until you do a full audit. And I think that's probably going to be the only way that you can finally put all of this to rest and have the people of Hardy County feel like the board is responsible to them and the money that is being spent. But I think that'd probably be, you've already spent $55,000 and you've still got questions. So you might as well just go ahead and do the whole shebang, and then there won't be any more questions. That's it, people. Don't be stirring up the pot.
thank you for your comments. Any other public comments? Mrs. Bellflower?
Pam Bellflower, 220 Old North in the city. My question is, did Clifton Larson Allen do an examination on some of the terms of the contract, not just the money? I mean, the terms of the contract for the classes, where there's supposed to be one class of so many people, and then another class, and another time of so many more people, and a third class. And it delineated in that contract exactly who those people would be. And also, another term of the contract was that Continuum Labs was to bring in other tech businesses to be in that building. And then another part of my question is, was there, and where is it, the hard signed contract between the IDA and Continuum Labs for that, what are you calling it? API and, the monthly licensing platform. I could not ever find one on the website nor in the contract. There should have been some sort of contract, because if you look up a software licensing on the internet, it tells you that there should be a contract between the person holding the license and whoever is using that license. So those are some questions I would like answered, please.
Okay. I think I can address the first portion of your questions. Clifton Larson Allen's engagement was to review this on the financial components and the financial aspects. We're not proposing this as a closeout of this project, and the terms of the contract, I think, would still at a future point be discussed and debated among the board members. So they were not engaged to do those items that you mentioned in the first part of your question. On the second part of your question about the API licensing, the licensing was not a contract between the IDA and Mr. Bond. The licensing was a contract where he was the contractor on the project. The initial project was LifeSync. So that contract, if it existed, would exist between those parties and not between Mr. Bond and the IDA. Any other public comment? If not, we have a motion on the table and it has been properly seconded. All those in favor of the motion? Anyone opposed? Okay, we are going to take a brief 5-minute break, and we will return at, well, let's make it 8 minutes, and we'll return at 10 after.
Getting it?
On his website and fly to Swan. That is Mr. Taylor. A little bit just getting into Are you a member? Don't wake up. We're Mr. Coleman. You better to jot down. How you doing? Look at the Randy. He wants to send Bill Lambert to Springfield Airport. He calls him. He tells him to bend over. That was his posting. Bend over. So he called It is. Facebook has even banned for a period of time. He's retired military and flew in his afternoon. He lives out of the edges of Fort Greene.